All right, so my name's JD Leahy. I'm a member of the Ecology Model Development Team. The whole team listed here on the slide, worked on this presentation and worked on the development of this module that we're going to talk about today. But it's my job, and I have the pleasure of presenting and facilitating the discussion sessions. Just before we get started, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be in here and making some time to call into these. I really appreciate that. The modeling team appreciates it, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. So I think, as most of you are aware, right, this webinar is part of an ongoing series of events that we've been putting on, for the development of our oil spill risk model. Our last webinar, which we had in August, right, we talked about our approach to our drift and momentum model. Today, we'll just start with a short refresher on kind of why we're doing this work and what the background is, but then we'll jump right into describing our oil outflow module and talk a little bit about next steps for model development that we see coming up down the road. So as always, today's not your only chance or last chance to provide input on the oil outflow module. Right, and also, even though I'm not presenting updates, specifically on the other topics that we've covered over the last number of months, we do still welcome feedback on those topics as well. If we have time in the discussion session, you're welcome to ask them today. You can also reach out, email, or telephone if you want to talk about those other aspects of model development. If there's questions that we can't get to today, things we can't fully answer, we'll get written answers out and posted on the webpage. There's also going to be a recording of this presentation that we'll put up on YouTube, and we'll also put up the slides. So there'll be a link to all those materials once they're up and online. So, as many of you know from our previous presentations, the model that we're going to talk about today is part of a group of measures that was passed by the legislature in 2019, right? And that series of measures was, designed to reduce the risk of oil spills and protect our southern resident killer whales. And the part that's most relevant to our conversation today specifically is that the bill requires Ecology to build an oil spill risk model, and that model has to be able to quantitatively assess the current and potential future risks of oil spills from covered vessels in Washington waters. So, that's what's brought us here today, that task. That's why we're going through these modules and talking with everyone about how we propose to build that model. So before we get too far into the oil outflow module discussion, I just want to revisit for a moment some of the foundational material underpinning our work on oil spill risk. We started with this almost a year ago now. So quantitative risk assessments, right, they have three parts. Establishing a discrete list of hazards, right? These are the scenarios, right? Then identifying the likelihood that those hazards might take place, right? That's the probability. And then evaluating the consequences, right? These three pieces are the core work of the model, right? If we're looking at estimating oil spill risk, right? What can go wrong? How likely is it? And how bad might it be if it does go wrong? And so particularly because we're talking about oil outflow today and the oil outflow module, I want to expand a little bit on the concept of consequences. So when we talk about consequence as part of a risk analysis, right, it can involve a lot of different factors, right, depending on the scope and the purpose of the analysis that's being done, right? In the context of consequence of oil spill risk, right, those factors, could just be oil spill magnitude, but they also, could incorporate ecological damage, cultural damage, human health effects, right, and other things. The outputs of the oil outflow module that we're going to talk about today, right, includes spill locations, dates, times, amounts, as well as, you know, the type of oil spilled, right? These are all the things represented on the left-hand side of the slide, right? These outputs alone may be a sufficient representation of consequence to meet the needs of most of the analysis projects that come our way, right? What that means is that, you know, depending on the questions asked by the analysis, just outflow information might be enough to answer those questions, right? Model outputs are there to help us compare the relative change in risk under different scenarios, right? To help us evaluate potential risk reduction from different interventions, right? The amount of oil in the water and the number of spills, you know, that have occurred will, you know, those could be sufficient metrics for a lot of our use cases. You know, looking at all the different consequences of an oil spill is really important work, but we can't look at those things first without first successfully building, you know, our foundational model. And so we feel this structure, right, these outputs that you see on the left, they meet our baseline requirements, and they also leave the door open to expand our evaluation of consequence if that's ever tasked to us. Okay. So with all that in mind, we'll do a quick review of the modeling approach here, and then we'll dig right into the oil outflow model. So just quickly, right, the first two of the core functions of risk analysis take place in the vessel accident module, right? This is where we take our list of hazards and we apply the probabilities that they might occur, right? Then in the oil outflow module, right, what we're going to talk about today, this is where we determine if a given modeled accident results in an oil spill, right? And if it does, how much oil spills, right? This right here, this is our representation of consequence, right? The vessel movement module is where we produce the data that we'll then evaluate, right? It's the place where we move vessels around, give us some activity to look at. In between here is the encounter module. It helps us filter some of those movements to identify moments where ships are close enough to one another or close enough to the ground where we can reasonably say that there's a potential for grounding or that there's a potential for collision. Similar in some ways to the vessel accident module, the oil outflow module is particularly important because the decisions around how we structure the oil outflow module, right, they impact the factors we can evaluate in terms of interventions, right? The factors we can evaluate as potentially relevant to outflow amounts. Okay, so the purpose of the oil outflow module, right? It has to answer two questions. After we've identified that an accident has occurred, is there a spill, right? Does oil enter the water? And then if there is a spill, how much oil enters the water? How much oil spilled, right? It could initially seem counterintuitive to ask whether an accident results in an oil spill, right? We have to think back to our initial hazard identification process. You know, during that process, we selected hazards that we think are relevant to spill risk, right? But just because they're relevant, it doesn't mean they necessarily produce an oil spill every time. So this structure, right, this type of relationship between the oil outflow module and the accident module, it means that oil spills and accidents are decoupled in the model. So in order to have an oil spill in the model simulation, it's essentially a two-part process. You have to have an accident, and then you have to have a spill. And the model evaluates the potential for each of those occurrences separately, right? And this is going to be the case for almost all of our modeled accidents. There are a couple of exceptions, right? And these are the hazards that are simultaneously a spill, right? For example, a transfer spill, right? The fact that a spill occurred is embedded in the definition of the hazard. But for all the other, or most of the other hazards, right, they are decoupled from the spill, right? Let's say, as an example of a decoupled approach, let's say a ship is moving within the model simulation, and based on the probability of historical sinkings, it sinks, right? Once the model identifies it as sinking, then it looks at whether it spills oil or not and how much oil it spills. So there's a number of benefits to this decoupling, right? The reasons basically that we decided to frame things this way. You know, as we've talked about pretty extensively, the world of maritime accidents has a problem around not enough data, right? Too little data. So especially we're faced with this when we limit ourselves to a local or regional population of interest. And if we further limit ourselves by only looking at accidents that result in oil spills, right, that's going to leave us with even fewer occurrences to evaluate. So the first benefit that we get is a wider lens for looking at hazard occurrences, right? This gives us a better shot at calculating hazard probability by including all hazard occurrences, not just those that resulted in oil spills. Another benefit is that we can look at the estimate of hazard occurrences independently of oil spills, right? So that's not really currently in the scope of any upcoming analysis, but because of this structural approach, right, the model could be capable or will be capable of estimating, you know, for instance, just the number of groundings, right, independent of whether there's an oil spill or how much oil is spilled. And lastly, because we're developing estimates for probability of spills independently of estimates for probability of hazards, we can use different populations of interest for evaluating these things. So why is that helpful? Well, if you remember back to our conversations about selecting a population of interest for establishing hazard probability, right, based on historical accidents, we had all these discussions about how, you know, an accident rate could be influenced by geographic and temporal factors, right? That specifics of the waterway could be relevant to groundings, or traffic density, you know, might be relevant to collisions, right? We have the same challenge, you know, when we're looking at establishing a population of interest for oil spill likelihood, right? We still need a population that's representative of the population we're trying to model. But the factors that drive representativeness, right, are different. So decoupling them like this allows us to think about these two populations of interest separately, right? And we, you know, can make different choices about how to define them, you know, if so desired. Okay, so how are we going to do this, right? How are we going to answer those two questions, right? Did a spill happen, and how much oil was spilled? So as always, right, as a modeling team and as a research team, right, we start with a literature review. And our literature review identified that there's essentially two categories of oil outflow models, right? There's statistical approaches that are based on data, and mathematical or mechanistic approaches that are based on theory. You know, the statistical models, right, they rely on incident databases like the Coast Guard's missile data set or Lloyd's IHS set, right? These databases have data on what proportion of vessels involved in particular accident types had an oil spill. And if they did have a spill, how much oil was spilled. And then, you know, on the other hand, the mathematical or theory-based models rely on our understanding of the physical processes and interrelationships to estimate damage from accidents and the potential for oil outflow based on that damage. Okay, so starting with the mathematical mechanistic approach, right? In our review of ship damage models from navigational accidents, right, there's basically two groups of ship damage models, right? The first focuses on estimating the size and nature of the hull damage, and the second focuses on estimating oil outflow dynamics given a hull breach, right? There's not a lot of models that combine both aspects, right? There are some hybrid models that attempt to combine these, right? And one that does that basically, and it combines these aspects was built using simulation results from two separate models, right? SimCol, which is like simulate collision, sort of an acronym for that, and damage model, it's called. So because those two models only looked at tank vessels and they only looked at collisions and groundings, right, the utility of that particular approach, is going to be best suited to those vessel types as well. Looking at these approaches that are available in the literature, right, there's a couple of main benefits to looking at oil outflow in this mechanistic way, right? When we're faced with events that don't have a lot of occurrences, right, like events that don't happen very often, it's hard to get a good picture, statistical picture of likelihood and severity, right? A mathematical model, a theory-based model can help with that, right? Because there's, relatively, in a statistical sense, few modern incidents involving tankers spilling oil, right? For those spills that have occurred, the range of possible spill volumes is so large that descriptive statistics struggles to represent potential spill size, right? A mechanistic model is able to provide an estimate of oil outflow volumes using physics to compensate for the lack of data, that would be needed to support a statistical approach. Their other value is their ability to incorporate factors we see as important to the dynamics that influence oil outflow, right? Instead of just being limited to the circumstances surrounding the examples we have in the historical record, we can examine, oil outflow potential based on factors that are, built into these models, right? Things like vessel speed, bottom characteristics, angle of the collision, right? Other things. But just like when we talked through the trade-offs around statistical and mechanistic approaches to hazard probability, right? When we talked through this in the accident module, right? We have the same challenges here as well, right? Ship damage and oil flow outflow dynamics are incredibly complex, right? And the models out there are only as good as they are, right? And they have to rely on a number of simplifications and assumptions. And confidently evaluating their accuracy, right, presents a number of challenges. Okay, so based on the models that are available that I briefly touched on a couple of slides ago, our plan is to move forward with this hybrid statistical mathematical model that was built from that set of simulated collisions and groundings for tank vessels, right? The model, excuse me, this is the basis, the same basis for the model that Rene Van Dorp and Jacek Merrick used for the VITRA risk analysis, and that same, foundational model that they used was expanded upon by others over the years, and it essentially represents the state of the art for oil outflow modeling, in particular for tank vessels, associated with simulation-based risk approaches. Right, one difference for us in how we plan to use this approach is that we don't plan to extend it beyond the original simulations that it was based on, right? That means we're only planning to use it for the vessel types and hazard types that form the original simulations, right? So that means only for tank vessels and only for groundings and collisions, right? In the VITRA work that some of us are familiar with, right, they expanded the model so it could estimate non-tank vessels by essentially treating them as tankers with empty cargo tanks. Our feeling is that's a pretty far departure from the original simulation work that those models and that regression analysis is based on. And we think there are better ways to estimate non-tank vessel oil outflow potential. Another need that we have is that we have a much more comprehensive list of accident types, right? And we can't use a mathematical approach, based on groundings and collisions, for estimating the potential spill from a sinking vessel, right? For instance, right? And those types of hazards just weren't included in the simulation that underlies the VITRA tool, or the tool that the VITRA used. So we're going to use a similar approach to what we saw in the VITRA for estimating oil outflow, but only for tank vessels and only for collisions and groundings. Okay, so how do we do that? If we're going to do that, what information, what parameters do we need in place to be able to use this modeling approach for this subset of vessel types and hazard types? So first, we use the outputs that the movement module provides, right? The speed of the vessel or vessels, the collision angle, right? Things like that. And then second, there's a set of parameters that need to be pulled from existing external data sources, right? Things like tank configuration, how many tanks are in the ship, how many longitudinal bulkheads, etc. There's also information, bathymetric information, like characteristics of the bottom, right? Like soft versus hard, for instance. Or, sandy versus rocky, maybe more specifically. And then third, there's a set of parameters that are based essentially on the rules or simplifications that we still need to come up with. These are things like the amount of oil cargo on board a ship, right? When and where are they laden, and at what percentage of capacity? And similarly for fuel, right? What's the percentage full that they're traveling at? These remain key questions for the model to answer. And as we make progress on approaches to them, we remain committed to discussing those with you all, right? We're not going to finalize those items without talking to you. But they do remain outstanding questions that we need to establish, a path forward for. One interesting requirement, to parameterize, to develop parameters for this oil outflow approach is a plan for how we're going to distribute oil between tanks, right? So, like I said, one set of parameters is the number and location of tanks in a ship. But then further, right, we need to establish rules for how the estimated amount of oil cargo is then distributed between those tanks. So I think, I saw folks registered, not to call anybody out, but I did see some tanker operators on the call, or at least registered. If you just want to shout out a simple set of rules for how we might think about distributing oil between tanks if it's not a full load on board, shout it out and we'll be all ears. Okay, so if we use that mathematical, mechanistic approach for tank vessels, for collisions and groundings, what do we propose for the rest of the vessel types? So our plan is to tackle this with a statistical approach, right? This is the same type of method that we outlined for establishing hazard probability calculations, right? So it should be mostly familiar, although there are some differences here. So, on the basic level, we need a population of interest, right? And then we need to count occurrences, right? We'll use this statistical approach for oil outflow potential for all hazards for non-tank vessels, and for oil outflow potential for tank vessels for those hazards other than groundings and collisions. So the plan for how to approach statistical potential for oil outflow has two parts. First, we need to determine if a spill took place, right? It's parallel to the work we did for hazard probability, right? We need a population of interest. This is the geographic and temporal constraints around the data that we review. Then we need to count up the occurrences in that data, right? These are the oil spills. Then we need to count up the opportunities, right? These are the linked hazards, like a grounding, for instance. How many spills occurred per grounding, right? Another way to think about it is we collect a bunch of examples of groundings, and then we look at whether they resulted in spills or not, right? We use the relationship between those two numbers to come up with a likelihood that given a grounding, right, simulated in the model, would there be a spill, or what would be the likelihood of a spill? Right? The more examples we find, the more detailed we can get with potential contributing factors, right? Things like ship type, collision angle, keel aid date, stuff like that. But unlike for our calculations for hazard probability, our work doesn't end here for oil outflow, because it's not enough to just know that an oil spill occurred. We also need to know how much oil was spilled, right? And how much oil isn't a yes or no question, right? In the way that, whether an accident occurred is. So when we look at oil quantity, right, we review the example oil spills that we have in the population of interest, and then we establish the quantities that were spilled. Then we need to build these into a function that represents the various likelihoods of all the potential amounts of oil that could have been spilled, right, limited by the capacity of the vessels involved. So when it comes to determining a population of interest for oil spill data, right, we'll be looking to establish broad boundaries for our investigation of past accidents, right? One reason for this is that we aren't able to use the same fallback approach, right? The zero failure approach, if you recall, that we can for hazard probability, right? That's because, of this requirement that we have to identify quantities spilled, right? There's no zero failure approach to estimating quantities. That said, we do feel pretty confident in our ability to identify a large enough population of interest, right? And one reason for this that I already mentioned, right, is that we don't see outflow amounts or spill likelihood as so linked to the geographic location where it occurred, right? A collision between two ships is a collision between two ships, right? Whatever part of the ocean it occurs in. The factors that play a larger role in outflow, right, are likely to be ship type, ship characteristics, right, and accident characteristics like speed and angle of the damage, right? We do recognize there could be some, statistical sensitivity, in terms of going too far back in time on oil spill likelihood and oil outflow amounts, right? Like, for instance, regulatory adjustments on protected fuel tanks means that we might see different spill amounts in more recent years as that rule has gone into effect, right? So there are some concerns here about selecting a relevant population of interest, but we feel that we are less constrained here than we are for accident likelihood. So with this overall approach, right, using a mechanistic model for tank vessel collisions and groundings, and then the statistical approach for everything else, right, there are some limitations and some challenges that I want to be clear on. So first, one key assumption here is that oil spills in the model are, quote unquote, instantaneous, right? In real life, a spill takes place over time, sometimes in complex ways, right? The Golden Ray salvage is a distressing example, right? They're still struggling with oil getting in the water, and it's been more than a year. But in order to use the approaches that are out there in the literature, right, we need to incorporate this simplification. So also, right, speaking of salvage, the mechanistic model that we're looking at, it just considers damage dealt to the hull and the dynamics of oil exiting to sea. It doesn't consider the interventions that might take place after an incident that could limit, continued oil spillage, right? So when we look at historical spill sizes for our statistical approach, these are going to reflect, actual spilled amounts, and they're going to incorporate by default efforts to limit spill size after the incident, right? But the mechanistic model doesn't do that, and it doesn't have that potential. But there are also challenges, right, on the statistical side of things as well, right? Depending on the data that we find in the population of interest that we select, we might not be able to incorporate many or any contributing factors, right? That means if we only find a small number of oil spills resulting from a given hazard type or a specific vessel type, we might not be able to evaluate statistical relevance of vessel speed or age, etc. Right? And another factor here is that not all incident reports are going to include, the information we might want them to, right? Things like, bottom characteristics, right, or angle of collision. So we're going to be limited by the quantity of the occurrences that we're able to identify, as well as the quality of the data that accompanies them. So that represents the core of the oil outflow model, right? Hybrid mechanistic approach in the same vein as the VITRA, but only for tank vessels and only for groundings and collisions. And then statistical, probabilistic approach for all other vessel types and for tank vessels involved in other types of accidents. So I want to round out the presentation today with an update on where we're at with model development. Today's presentation is a milestone. It represents the last of the 4 modules in our modeling approach that we first laid out in summer of 2020, right? We started with vessel movement. We talked about vessel encounters. We went through the vessel accident module, including the drift and momentum model. And now, we've presented our plan for the oil outflow module. And this represents a turning point, for the team. So, we've always been multitasking in the background, right? Working on model components while simultaneously researching and sketching out the methodological strategies for each module, right? The completion of this presentation means that we can now turn our full attention to the task of building out the model, right? Now that we have the structure in place, we put it in front of you, we've received feedback on it, we can focus on building that structure. In terms of where we're at with model development and which modules we're working on, right? We're currently focused on the vessel movement module, and we're deep in coding, for the movement rules that allow vessels to avoid violating the special operating area rules at Turn Point, and also the rules at Rosario and Connected Waters. We're making good progress on coding the movements of dependent vessels, right, including pilot boats and escort tugs, and we expect to move on relatively soon to coding bunkering vessels, in the next few weeks. We're also simultaneously working on the calculation approach for establishing different ship domains, right? So you could see that, while we've been putting together this research, putting together these presentations, kind of establishing and sharing with you, the methods, the methodological plan for our approach and all these modules, the build out of the model is still in relatively early stages. So in terms of outreach, up until now, our priority has been outlining the structure of the model and the modules you're familiar with, right? And communicating that structure to you and getting feedback on it. And that's been a rewarding process for the team. The webinars, the technical discussions, those all serve to sharpen our thinking on these topics, and your questions and feedback, helped us improve the model structure and the ways that we talk about it. Now, with the structure of the model outlined, we're transitioning to implementation, the coding, the testing, and making reality, all of the plans that we presented to you. So in terms of outreach, for our next communication on model development, we want to make sure that we're able to answer the questions folks have about the structure of the model. And so to do that, we need time in the interim to prioritize build-out work. So our best estimate is that we'll be ready for those conversations in spring 2022, right? This break from webinars is designed to help us live up to that commitment of supporting meaningful involvement and feedback, right? I know that you've noticed, there's a challenge with these events is, that there's a lot of remaining unknowns, right? Folks ask clarifying questions, and we have to tell you that we haven't gotten that far yet. So our commitment is that in spring of 2022, when we communicate to tribes and stakeholders, we'll have more answers to your questions on model structure, right? But simultaneously, our commitment is that even then, while we will have made progress, we're still committed to receiving feedback and being able to make adjustments to model structure based on that feedback, as necessary. So, moving from summer to fall and winter, it's a perfect time to hunker down and get our coding and structural pieces in place, and we look forward to showing our work and getting your feedback this spring. We also have upcoming discussions and outreach for the 2 analysis projects, right? So you don't have to wait too long to hear from us again. Current status there is that we have draft scopes of work published and out for comment for both of the 2 analysis projects. They're both awaiting your feedback and are open. Feedback is open till the end of the month. We'll transition to robust outreach, parallel in some ways to how we've done these model development events in 2022.